At its peak, this company was worth more than $400 billion, more than Apple, more than Google, and more than any other company in Canadian history. Then, in less than 2 years, it lost 99% of its value and took the entire retirement savings of thousands of employees down with it. This is the story of Nortel Networks, and the reason it collapsed is stranger and darker than you've probably heard. Nortel wasn't always a tech giant. It started in the 1880s as a small telephone equipment maker attached to Bell Canada. For almost a century, it just existed, quietly making switches and phone hardware, nothing that would make headlines. But then the internet happened, and Nortel decided to go all in. Through the late 1990s, the company transformed itself into a fiber optic and internet networking powerhouse. It was buying companies, filing patents, and signing contracts at a pace that seemed almost supernatural. By the summer of 2000, Nortel's stock price had climbed so high that the company alone made up 35% of the entire Toronto Stock Exchange. Think about that. One company, over a third of a major national stock exchange. Pension funds across Canada were loaded with Nortel shares. Millions of ordinary people's retirements were quietly tied to whatever happened next. And here's where the first open loop starts, because everyone assumes Nortel collapsed purely because of the dot-com crash. That's what most people think. But the real story involves something much worse, something that was hidden inside the company long before the market turned. We'll get there. First, let's talk about just how fast the fall was. In the year 2000, Nortel's stock hit over $120 per share. By 2002, it was trading at under $1. That's not a dip. That's financial annihilation. Employees who had been encouraged, sometimes pressured, to hold their retirement accounts in Nortel stock watched decades of savings evaporate. One engineer who had worked there for over 20 years walked away with almost nothing. Stories like that were everywhere. It wasn't just a bad investment. For thousands of families, it was a catastrophe. So what actually happened? Part of it was timing. The dot-com bubble bursting in 2000 hit every tech company hard. Demand for fiber optic infrastructure cratered almost overnight. Nortel had spent billions building capacity for a demand curve that suddenly reversed. Revenues collapsed. The company started hemorrhaging cash. But here's the part that turns this from a sad story into a shocking one. In 2004, 2 years after the worst of the crash, Nortel announced it had been restating its financial results. Turns out, the company's books had been manipulated. Executives had been playing games with reserves, essentially moving money around to hit specific earnings targets, which triggered massive bonuses for senior leadership. The same leadership that was steering the company off a cliff was quietly making sure they got paid on the way down. Now, here's the second thing most people don't know. 3 former Nortel executives, the CEO, CFO, and controller, were actually charged with fraud in Canada. And after years of legal battles, all 3 were acquitted. The judge found that the accounting was aggressive, possibly even reckless, but couldn't prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. So nobody went to prison. The executives walked. The employees lost everything. Let that sink in for a second. Nortel filed for bankruptcy protection in January 2009, during the financial crisis, which, by brutal coincidence, made the whole thing even worse for anyone still holding claims. The bankruptcy dragged on for years, but even in death, Nortel had one more twist that almost nobody talks about. When Nortel collapsed, it left behind something surprisingly valuable, a patent portfolio. Over 6,000 patents, covering core wireless and internet technologies. And in 2011, a consortium that included Apple, Microsoft, Sony, Ericsson, and RIM paid $4.5 billion to acquire that portfolio at auction. Google had also bid aggressively for the patents and lost. $4.5 billion for the intellectual property of a bankrupt company. That's more than most living companies are worth. Nortel had created real, foundational technology. The execution had failed, but the innovation was undeniably real. Here's the pattern interrupt that reframes everything. Most people look at Nortel as a failure story, but consider this. Those patents shaped the smartphone wars of the 2010s. Apple used them in litigation against Android. The technology that Nortel's engineers built in the 1990s was considered so foundational to modern wireless communication that the most valuable companies in the world paid billions to control it, years after the company that created it no longer existed. Nortel's engineers built the future. The executives just couldn't keep the lights on long enough to see it. So why does this story matter beyond the history lesson? A few reasons. First, Nortel is the reason Canada overhauled rules around pension fund concentration, the idea that employees should be protected from being forced into overconcentration in their own employer's stock.
Reforms came directly from the wreckage of this collapse. Second, the forensic accounting scandals at Nortel became a case study in business schools and regulatory agencies worldwide. The phrase cookie jar reserves, hiding profits in good years to release them later for bonuses, is something compliance officers still cite today. And the third reason, the one I promised we'd come back to. Remember the question about why the collapse was stranger than the dot-com crash alone? Here it is.
Nortel's internal fraud investigation found evidence that outsiders had accessed the company's most sensitive computer systems, research files, business plans, employee credentials, for years. And the suspect source was a state-level actor. Specifically, hackers traced back to servers in China. Security researchers who later examined the breach called it one of the longest and deepest corporate espionage operations ever uncovered at a North American company. Think about what that means. While executives were manipulating earnings and the stock was cratering, someone may have been systematically stealing the intellectual core of the company. The patents eventually sold for $4.5 billion, and the technology behind them had potentially been copied and studied for nearly a decade before that auction ever happened. Nortel had everything. The timing was right, the technology was real, the talent was world-class, and the company still collapsed because of fraud, mismanagement, and possibly one of the most damaging cyber espionage campaigns in corporate history. There is no single villain here. There's a failure at nearly every level that makes Nortel one of the most instructive business disasters ever recorded. If you found this story as wild as I did, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.